For years, one story was treated as closed, a death ruled natural, a chapter Hollywood quietly moved past. But now something has changed. Because when you slow the timeline down, when you line up what we were told against what was never fully explained, Kim Porter's death stops looking like a simple tragedy and starts looking like a question no one ever wanted answered. In November of 2018, Kim Porter was found unresponsive in her Los Angeles home. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was listed as lobar pneumonia following flu-like symptoms. The case was ruled natural. No foul play, no investigation, file closed. That's the version most people remember. What most people don't remember is how fast that conclusion came and how many unanswered details were left behind. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Do you believe every high-profile death that's ruled natural is actually examined with the same level of scrutiny? Or do you think some stories are closed before all the questions are asked? And if you're new here, subscribe now because this story doesn't move in headlines, it moves in layers. Kim Porter wasn't just Sean Diddy Combs' former partner. She was the mother of 3 of his children. She was present through the rise of bad boy records, the industry relationships, the private world that never made it to cameras. And by 2018, according to people close to her, she wasn't just an observer anymore, she was someone who had seen enough to be careful. Officially, Kim began feeling ill in early November. A sore throat, then a fever. She sought medical treatment and was prescribed antibiotics. According to reports, her flu test came back negative. Despite that, she was said to be recovering. Well enough, in fact, that she had a massage at her home the night before she died. That detail matters more than people realize. Because pneumonia severe enough to cause sudden death typically doesn't look like recovery. It doesn't look like normal movement. It doesn't look like scheduling routine services. Yet within days, not weeks, not months, Kim Porter was gone. November 7th, sore throat. November 12th, fever. November 15th, deceased. For a healthy woman with no publicly known underlying conditions, that timeline is rare. Not impossible, but rare. And rarity is where questions begin. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled the death non-suspicious and closed the case in 2019. No further investigation, no public toxicology deep dive, no extended inquiry, just a quiet conclusion in silence. But silence doesn't erase memory. And it doesn't erase what people closest to Kim began saying carefully, quietly, and often after stepping back. One of those voices belonged to Al B. Sure, Kim's former partner and the biological father of Quincy Brown. Years after Kim's passing, Al publicly stated that he did not believe pneumonia alone explained what happened. In a video that later disappeared, he said plainly that something didn't add up, that Kim had confided fears, that she had sent messages that felt unresolved, unfinished, like someone sensing danger without being able to name it. Those claims were never tested in court. They were never investigated. They were simply absorbed into the background noise of celebrity commentary until something else happened. Quincy Brown, the son Diddy helped raise but never legally controlled, remained silent. And that silence was loud. Quincy attended court proceedings. He appeared composed. He never defended Diddy publicly. He never accused him either. No emotional posts, no dramatic statements, just distance. While others in Diddy's circle found themselves entangled in lawsuits, headlines, and even handcuffs during the 2024 federal raids, Quincy was absent from the chaos. Not visible, not reactive. That wasn't fear. That was positioning. Because when people stay quiet while the ground is shifting, it usually means they're waiting for something or someone to lose leverage. And by the time federal authorities moved on Diddy's properties, leverage was already disappearing. Around the same time, a new variable entered the story again: 50 Cent. Officially, 50 Cent is an executive producer on a Netflix project connected to Diddy's downfall. Netflix has stated publicly that while he is involved, he does not control the narrative. That matters because it places the responsibility on documentation, not personal rivalry. What also matters is what that documentary didn't fully address. Kim Porter. Her death was mentioned. Her story was acknowledged, but it wasn't explored, and that omission raised eyebrows. Why leave out the one event that predates everything else? Why skip the moment that, in hindsight, sits at the center of the timeline? According to sources familiar with the project, that wasn't an accident. It was restraint. Because revisiting Kim Porter's case requires more than speculation. It requires corroboration, documentation, and people willing to speak carefully. And that brings us back to Quincy. Insiders claim Quincy has been quietly reaching out to individuals who knew Kim before 2018, former friends, associates, people who were present in the final years, gathering accounts, comparing timelines, preserving information, not publishing, not leaking, preserving. Because once something is public, it's also vulnerable. Another detail that has never been fully explained is what happened to Kim's personal devices after her death. Multiple individuals, including Al B. Shore, have claimed that Kim's phone, laptop, and notes were removed from her home shortly after she passed. These claims have never been confirmed in court, but they've also never been formally addressed. If untrue, they could have been easily dismissed. If true, they raise questions no one seems eager to answer, especially when paired with reports of a manuscript and alleged memoir Kim was said to be working on, a document Diddy's team dismissed as fake, a document others insist was real, saved digitally, and never recovered. Again, no proof has been presented publicly. But patterns don't need conclusions to be concerning. They only need consistency. And consistency is what keeps pulling this story forward despite years of silence. Kim Porter's death was ruled natural. The case was closed. But the people closest to her never fully moved on. And now, with Diddy's empire fractured, his legal position weakened, and federal scrutiny intensifying, the timing has shifted. Questions that once felt dangerous to ask now feel unavoidable. Not accusations. Questions. And in stories like this, questions are where everything begins. Because once control slips, answers tend to follow. The reason these questions never fully disappeared is because Kim Porter wasn't just a private citizen whose passing faded with time. Her life intersected with power, money, and an industry built on silence. And when someone inside that ecosystem dies suddenly, every unanswered detail carries more weight. What makes Kim's case different isn't just the medical timeline. It's what happened around it. According to public records, emergency responders arrived at Kim's home on the morning she was found unresponsive. There was no forced entry, no immediate signs of trauma, which is exactly why the case moved so quickly toward a natural conclusion. On paper, it made sense. But investigations aren't only about what's visible, they're about context. Kim Porter had no documented history of chronic illness, no known immune disorder, no pattern of hospitalizations. Friends described her as active, involved, and present in her children's lives. Yet within 8 days of initial symptoms, she was gone. And once the coroner issued the ruling, there was no pushback from authorities to dig further. That lack of curiosity is what troubles people who've worked around high-profile cases. Because sudden deaths often raise procedural questions, especially when the person involved has proximity to someone under constant scrutiny. And by 2018, Sean Combs was already surrounded by legal whispers, industry rumors, and private allegations that hadn't yet gone public. What's often overlooked is that Kim had distanced herself from Diddy years earlier. Their relationship had ended, but their lives remained intertwined through family, history, and shared knowledge. She knew the people, the places, the routines, and according to people who claim to have spoken with her in private, she wasn't naive about what that knowledge meant. That's where the fear narrative quietly enters. Al B. Shore later stated that Kim had expressed concern about her safety, not panic, not hysteria, concern. The kind that doesn't come with dramatic claims, but with guarded conversations and vague warnings. He described messages that felt unfinished, as if Kim wanted to say more, but didn't feel safe doing so explicitly. Those statements were never tested in court. They were never sworn testimony, but they exist. and they matter because they add emotional context to an otherwise sterile timeline. Then there's what happened to Al himself. In 2022, Al B. Sure collapsed suddenly and was hospitalized with multi-system organ failure. He spent weeks in a coma. Doctors reportedly struggled to explain how a previously functional adult could deteriorate so rapidly. When he recovered, he made statements suggesting he believed his collapse was not accidental, that his phone and laptop had been taken, that there was an attempt to silence him. Again, no proof has been presented publicly, no charges were filed, but coincidence has limits. And when multiple people connected to the same story experience sudden medical crises, people start drawing lines even when no one wants them drawn. Meanwhile, Quincy Brown continued to say nothing. That silence became more noticeable as Diddy's legal problems escalated. Lawsuits, federal investigations, raids. Allegations that had once lived on the margins were now front-page news. And yet, Quincy didn't rush to defend the man who raised him. He didn't attack him either. He simply stayed positioned on the edge of the frame. Industry insiders say that Quincy understood something most people didn't: timing. Speaking too early can discredit you. Speaking too late can make you irrelevant. The only effective moment is when power has already started to collapse. And collapse is exactly what we're witnessing. As federal scrutiny intensified, questions that once felt taboo began resurfacing. Online discussions revisited Kim's case. Old interviews were rewatched. Statements that once seemed emotional now felt measured. And people began asking why certain details had never been clarified. One of those details was the reported presence of a masseuse in Kim's home shortly before her death. From a medical standpoint, it's unusual. Not impossible, but unusual for someone in the late stages of pneumonia to engage in non-essential services. It suggests either that Kim didn't believe she was in serious danger or that her condition wasn't presenting as life-threatening. Both interpretations complicate the official narrative. Then there's the flu test. Negative, and yet pneumonia progressed rapidly. Antibiotics were prescribed, which implies bacterial involvement. But no detailed explanation has ever been released explaining why her condition deteriorated so fast despite treatment. In high-profile cases, medical opacity often breeds speculation, not because people want conspiracy, but because silence invites it. And silence has been the dominant response here. No press conference, no extended medical explanation, no public timeline clarification, just a closed file. That might have worked years ago. But it doesn't work in an era where documentation resurfaces and where multiple narratives can exist at once. Add to this the growing attention around patterns of behavior attributed to Diddy in unrelated lawsuits, allegations of control, coercion, intimidation, and Kim's case starts to feel less isolated. Not connected by evidence, connected by context. And context is powerful. When people begin reassessing the past through the lens of newly revealed behavior, old conclusions are often challenged, not overturned, challenged. That's where this story is now. Not in the realm of accusation, not in the realm of proof, but in the space between. And that space is where documentaries are born, where questions are framed, where narratives are re-examined. Which is why the idea of a new project, one that centers Kim's story, rather than skimming past it, has drawn so much attention. Because if Quincy Brown is involved, that changes the credibility calculus. He isn't an outsider. He isn't a commentator. He was there. He lived inside the family structure. He saw the dynamics up close. And if he's chosen to wait until now, that choice alone tells us something important. It tells us this story isn't being rushed. It's being prepared. And preparation usually means one thing: there's more beneath the surface than what we've been shown so far. Because when silence lasts this long, it's rarely empty. As these questions quietly resurfaced, something else began happening at the same time. The public narrative around Sean Combs started to fracture. Not because of Kim Porter's case directly, but because of what was being revealed elsewhere. Civil lawsuits began outlining patterns, not isolated incidents, but repeated behavior described across different years, different locations, and different people. Allegations of control, Allegations of coercion, allegations of intimidation. Each lawsuit stood on its own, but together they painted a picture that forced people to reconsider the past. When behavior repeats, history gets re-examined. That's when Kim's story stopped feeling like an old footnote and started feeling like a missing chapter. What people often forget is that Kim Porter lived through multiple eras of Diddy's career. She wasn't adjacent to the fame, she was inside it. She saw how power worked when cameras were off. She watched how loyalty was rewarded and how silence was enforced. And according to those close to her, she understood the cost of speaking too freely. That context matters when evaluating why she may have felt afraid, cautious, or guarded in the years before her death. It also matters when evaluating why others may have stayed quiet after. In high-profile circles, silence isn't always fear. Sometimes it's calculation. Sometimes it's survival. As lawsuits piled up and federal attention intensified, media outlets began revisiting old material. Interviews were clipped differently. Statements that once sounded emotional now sounded prophetic. People started noticing how often pneumonia appeared in conversations around sudden celebrity deaths connected directly or indirectly to the same social orbit. No one claimed proof. But people noticed repetition. Heavy D passed away at 44 after a pneumonia-related illness. Brittany Murphy died at 32, with pneumonia listed as a contributing factor. Bobby Christina Brown was found unresponsive, with pneumonia cited in medical findings. Different lives, different circumstances, but the same word kept appearing. Again, no evidence linking these cases exists publicly. No investigation ever suggested foul play, but patterns don't need conclusions to make people uncomfortable. They only need to repeat, and discomfort is what drives scrutiny. That scrutiny intensified when reports surfaced that Diddy's legal team had taken an aggressive stance, not just denying allegations, but launching a massive defamation lawsuit reportedly valued at $100 million. The move was framed as offensive strategy, not defense, a signal meant to intimidate, discourage, and slow momentum. But aggressive legal action can sometimes do the opposite. It draws attention. It invites examination. It keeps stories alive longer than silence ever could, especially when paired with documentaries. Netflix, for its part, has publicly stated that projects involving controversial figures are evaluated through evidence, not vendettas. That executive producers do not control narratives unilaterally. That claims are vetted. That legal review is extensive. Those statements matter because they signal caution. And caution suggests awareness. Which brings us back to the missing pieces in Kim Porter's case. According to claims that have circulated for years, Kim's personal devices disappeared shortly after her death. Her phone, her laptop, notes she may have kept. Whether those claims are true has never been confirmed, but the absence of clarity fuels speculation. In cases involving sudden death, personal devices are often preserved. They provide context, communication, history, health research, emotional state. Their disappearance, if it occurred, represents a lost opportunity for understanding. And lost opportunities create shadows. Then there's the alleged manuscript. Multiple individuals, including people who worked in production circles, have stated publicly that Kim was working on a memoir, a personal account of her life, her experiences, and her time within Diddy's orbit. Diddy's team dismissed the claim as false. Her children distanced themselves from it publicly. But dismissals aren't refutations, they're statements. And statements don't erase the possibility that something existed, even if it was never finished. What's clear is this: if such a document existed, and if it contains sensitive information, its disappearance would benefit some people far more than others. That's not an accusation. That's a reality of incentive. Which is why Quincy Brown's role is so significant. Quincy isn't a blogger, he isn't a commentator, he isn't chasing relevance. He has stayed quiet while the noise grew louder around him. And now, as pressure mounts, his silence feels less like absence and more like restraint. People close to the situation claim Quincy has been methodical, that he's spoken privately to people who knew Kim before fame changed everything, that he's asked questions rather than making statements. that he's focused on preserving information, not publishing it prematurely. That approach aligns with one goal: credibility. Because in cases like this, credibility is everything. The moment speculation overtakes documentation, a story collapses. The moment emotion replaces structure, the audience disengages. And the moment conclusions are drawn without proof, the truth becomes irrelevant. That's why the slow pace matters. That's why this story has unfolded over years, not weeks. And that's why its reemergence now feels intentional. With Diddy's legal footing weakened, with allies distancing themselves, and with federal scrutiny reshaping the landscape, the cost of silence has changed. What once felt dangerous to question now feels necessary to revisit. Not to accuse, not to convict, but to understand. Because understanding is the only thing that brings closure, and closure is what Kim Porter never received publicly. Her death was ruled natural. The file was closed. But the story was never finished. And when unfinished stories collide with collapsing power, they tend to resurface whether anyone is ready or not. Because control can delay truth, but it can't erase it. And as the pressure builds, as projects take shape, and as voices once quiet begin preparing to speak, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This isn't just about what happened to Kim Porter. It's about why so many questions were never answered, and who benefited from that silence. At this point, the question isn't whether Kim Porter's case will ever be officially reopened. The real question is whether the public is finally ready to look at it without dismissing discomfort as conspiracy. Because what's unfolding now isn't rumor-driven chaos. It's pressure. Pressure created by lawsuits. Pressure created by federal scrutiny. Pressure created by patterns that are no longer isolated. When powerful systems operate unchecked for decades, they don't collapse all at once. They fracture. First quietly, then visibly, then irreversibly. That's where this story sits right now. Sean Combs is no longer operating from a position of control. His legal team is reacting, not dictating. Former allies are distancing themselves. Corporate partners are reassessing risk. And most importantly, people who once had reasons to stay silent are reassessing their silence. That shift changes everything. Because when power weakens, information moves. Sources who were once unreachable suddenly respond. Files that were once inaccessible resurface. Conversations that were once private begin finding daylight. Not all at once, but gradually. And in that environment, Kim Porter's name keeps resurfacing. Not as an accusation, not as a verdict, but as a missing truth. Her case represents something larger than one tragedy. It represents how easily uncomfortable narratives can be closed when the person at the center can no longer speak for themselves. The official explanation says pneumonia. The official record says natural causes. And legally, that's where it stands. But socially, culturally, and historically, that explanation no longer satisfies the questions being asked, especially when viewed alongside the broader picture. The lawsuits describing coercion, the testimonies outlining fear, the industry accounts of silence and intimidation, the repeated theme of control. None of that proves what happened to Kim Porter, but it reframes why her story matters. Because stories don't exist in isolation. They exist inside systems. And systems protect themselves. That's why documentaries matter. Not because they deliver verdicts, but because they preserve narratives that would otherwise be erased. They force timelines to be re-examined. They bring competing accounts into the same frame. And they remind the public that official doesn't always mean complete. If Quincy Brown is indeed preparing to participate in a project that centers his mother's story, it will mark a turning point not because of what he accuses, but because of what he confirms. Confirmation doesn't require allegations. It requires presence. It requires saying, I was there. I saw this. I lived this. And sometimes that alone reshapes history. For years, Quincy stayed silent while others speculated. That silence protected him from being discredited. It allowed him to observe, to learn who spoke recklessly and who spoke carefully, who chased attention and who waited. Now, as the environment changes, his silence reads differently. It reads like patience, and patience is dangerous to people who rely on control. Because control thrives on urgency, confusion, and distraction. Patience thrives on clarity. That's why the next phase of this story won't arrive as a sudden explosion. It will arrive as documentation, as structured narratives, as carefully sourced accounts that are difficult to dismiss. And once those accounts exist, they can't be erased. No amount of defamation lawsuits can undo public memory. No amount of denial can reverse documented timelines. No amount of money can fully silence collective scrutiny. That's the reality powerful figures eventually face. Not downfall exposure. Exposure doesn't always mean guilt, but it always means accountability. And accountability is what's been missing from Kim Porter's story. Her passing was treated as an ending. But endings require understanding. And understanding was never delivered. Now, years later, as the system that once protected everything around her begins to crack, her story is being pulled back into the light. Not to accuse, not to sensationalize, but to ask the questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Why was the case closed so quickly? Why were medical details never expanded upon? Why did people closest to her express fear? Why did personal devices allegedly disappear? Why did silence follow for years? Those questions don't imply answers. They demand them. And as more people revisit the past with clearer eyes, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Control delayed this conversation, but it didn't stop it. Because truth doesn't need permission to resurface. It only needs time. And time is no longer on the side of those who built empires on silence. So now the story waits not for a headline, not for a rumor, not for a viral clip, but for the moment when evidence, memory, and accountability finally intersect. When that happens, Kim Porter won't just be remembered as a tragic footnote. She'll be remembered as the question that never went away. If you've watched this far, you already understand why this story matters. So make sure you're subscribed, because when the next piece of this breaks, we'll be here to examine it carefully and completely. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the full truth about Kim Porter's passing will ever be officially acknowledged, or will it remain one of Hollywood's most carefully avoided questions? Because this story isn't over. It's only just entering its most dangerous chapter.